This podcast is brought to you thanks to the generous support of Whistler Blackcomb, leaders in delivering adventure.
I had that happen once, teaching a lesson, kind of frozen coral head snow amongst the trees, and I love that kind of snow. And I was probably skiing faster than I should have been in that snow with my guest. Fell, my hand hit a tree, I broke my thumb, lesson was over. So I didn't make the right decisions in that situation. I ended up getting hurt, and so lesson was over. Guest didn't have the best day.
Welcome to Delivering Adventure. This is the podcast that explores what it really takes to share adventure like a pro, with your friends, your family, and as a profession. My name is Chris Capio, and I'm coming to you from Whistler, British Columbia.
And I'm Jordy Shepard, recording from Canmore, Alberta. After a lifetime of working extensively in different parts of the adventure guiding industry, Chris and I have teamed up to launch this podcast. In each episode, you will hear top adventure guides, managers, marketers, and athletes share their best stories, advice, and trade secrets. The goal of this podcast is to share how you can take yourself and others farther from the mountains to the office and beyond. One of the essential elements to managing risk when we're delivering adventure to others is understanding and managing people's risk tolerance. Our risk tolerance is a level of comfort that we have with loss. In the context of adventure, that loss is often manifested in a physical injury or damage. Being able to determine a person's risk tolerance in a given moment is a key component to building trust, improving their performance, coaching them through danger, and helping them to control their fear. One person who has made a successful career of managing her own risk tolerance and the risk tolerance of others is Robin Barnes. Robin is the Director of Ski Services at Heavenly Mountain Resort. Her current role is to oversee the operations of the snow school. In addition to working at Heavenly, Robin has previously spent 31 seasons working at Portillo Chile as an instructor and the ski and snowboard school director.
Robin is a 4-time Alpine Team Member with the Professional Ski Instructors of America. That's the PSIA. In addition to skiing, she's a fitness trainer, mountain biker, has worked as a ski tester for Ski Magazine, and is fluent in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Robin basically does it all. Robin brings a ton of practical experience to this subject. This episode is the perfect add-on to Grant Statham's episode on understanding and managing risk and adventure in Season 1, and Will Gadd's episode on communicating risk earlier in this season. If you haven't already done so, please make sure you hit the follow button in your podcast player so that you don't miss out on future episodes. Jordy and I have put a lot of time into putting this podcast together, and we have a lot of great content already recorded and much more to come. Okay, let's bring in Robin.
Hi, Robin. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you very much, Chris and Jordy. Great to be here.
So where are you right now?
I am in spectacularly beautiful South Lake Tahoe, California.
Nice. The weather's been good?
Weather's been amazing. It went pretty much from winter right into really beautifully warm spring weather. Snow's melting, mountain bikes coming out. It's really nice spring.
Awesome. So can you tell us about your path into the adventure industry? How did you get to where you are right now?
Yeah, if the adventure industry is life, I guess I was born into it. But more specifically from my professional world, I started teaching skiing about 30 years ago, and I've had a bunch of different roles in the industry. Like a lot of people that live in Lake Tahoe, California, I came here on vacation once and chose to never go home. I really liked it. Started getting involved with ski education, just really liked it. Have built a career around it, feel pretty grateful about that. And I think anytime we're asking people to trust us and I guess expose themselves to a little bit of risk in our care, that by default puts us in the adventure industry.
And when you were vacationing, where did you come from?
Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts.
Okay, so East Coast.
East Coast, you got it.
All right. And can you tell us about your current roles, what you're doing right now?
Sure. I love that you said current roles because I feel like I do wear a few different hats. I'm currently I work for Vail Resorts. I work for Heavenly Mountain Resort in South Lake Tahoe, California. My title here is that I'm the director of skier services, which means that a bunch of our guest service facing departments, including our ski and ride school and competition teams, roll up to me. I just retired from my fourth 4-year term as a national demo team member, which is the Canadian equivalent of the inner ski team. Just retired from doing that. Prior to that, I was a snow sports school director in Portillo, Chile. Instructor for a long time. I'm a skier and I'm a mountain biker.
Today we're talking about risk tolerance, which is, could be viewed as a pretty specific topic or maybe a very broad topic. So we'll see where it takes us. So what do we mean by risk tolerance, and what does it look like, and what does it sound like?
What does it look like? So I think when I consider risk tolerance, we're all someplace on that spectrum, right? One of the easiest ways for me to explain it is to use the analogy of investing. And like, your risk tolerance with investing is what you're comfortable losing, what you're willing to risk or lose. And similar, if we're talking about a safety risk, how much we put ourselves out there or don't put ourselves in there, and what we're comfortable losing or giving up. Some of us have a great appetite for risk. Some of us are very risk averse. And I think that the more risk tolerant you are, the more appetite you have for risk, the more sound your decision-making skills and decision-making plan around that have to be. And what does it sound like? It probably sounds like, woohoo, or yikes, depending on which end of that spectrum you are.
That's a great description. Yeah. Could go either direction.
Could go either direction.
Maybe a little bit of both.
Hopefully a little bit of both, yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you can ask somebody, what their risk tolerance is, but then when it actually comes to it and they're actually experiencing whatever they've been exposed to for risk and the consequences of that, they might feel quite differently if they were to quickly look back on it. So why is it important to understand someone's risk tolerance? What happens if we don't, like with our clients or other people in our group, other people around us?
Yeah, I think, to use your word, in the adventure industry, I think those of us that are in the adventure industry, we make a living basically by asking people to lend trust to us. And with the kind of other end of that deal, that we will help instill confidence in whatever it is that they're doing. And part of that process, confidence, trust spectrum, is being able to understand, manipulate, guide, and I guess test to a certain degree another person's risk tolerance. And if, for example, I'm out skiing with somebody and they tell me that they have a very high tolerance, then I can make some assumptions about the fact that they're okay working a little bit harder, they're okay in maybe a high exposure environment. But at the end of the day, I always need to check in with somebody and see, like, really, how are they doing? Not only how did you perceive that you're going to do, but how are you actually doing on any given time? Maybe you're tired, maybe you perceive that this wouldn't be a big deal and it is, or vice versa. I personally, I think, again, those of us that are in this industry, we're pretty decent at reading people for the most part, but there's nothing like asking somebody and really getting a concrete answer. I personally use a 1 to 10 scale a lot. I use it for a lot of different things, but particularly, how scary is this to you? And maybe it's a first-time skier making their first ever wedge turn. Like, there's a risk there. So how scary was that to you? Is that a 1 or a 10? 10 being maybe easy and 1 being scary. And I like to just, the more time I spend with that person, the more time I understand what their 8 means, what their 3 means. Because for some people, the 8 is fun when it's very low risk. And for some people, the 1 or the 2 or the 3, where it's very high risk, is super fun. And it's so important to just modulate what we're doing and manipulate the environment and how we're coaching in that environment to accommodate somebody so that they can perform their best, so that they are feeling confident. So I am instilling trust. I think that's just an ongoing conversation that needs to happen constantly, because we're human beings and we change a lot. We change depending on the day, the environment, the snow. Maybe I'm skiing with a client who's a very expert skier, and their wheelhouse is on ice, for example. And I can take that person onto a steep icy run and they can feel pretty comfortable. And then maybe it snows in the next day and it's 3 feet of powder, and all of a sudden that environment changed. And so I need to make sure I keep checking in with that person on where their comfort level is then. Are they past it? Are they like right up, butting up to their threshold? Just a constant dialogue that I think we need to have. And there's a lot of things that we can observe and we can watch. Is their performance suffering? Is it getting better? Are they breathing heavy? Are they cranky? Are they giggling? There's so many physical manifestations of going past your threshold. But in my opinion and my experience, the best is just keep the dialogue going constantly and keep asking, keep checking in.
Yeah, it's interesting. You spoke about financial risk tolerance, right, as a bit of an analogy. And I would say like it's kind of similar. It's possibly different, right? So when you're in the outdoor industry versus dealing with money, like somebody might, tell their investment advisor, I'm risk tolerant, because the reward is potentially bigger, right? And the reward is potentially bigger the more we take risks in the outdoor world. But on the other hand, the consequences are like, you just broke your arm, or, those like they're physical or emotional or mental consequences, psychological consequences that could stay with us for a long time. And whereas I think a lot of people do feel it's unfortunate, but money it's a thing, right? And it's important, but on the other hand, it's not our personal well-being that's at risk necessarily. And with this kind of stuff in the adventure industry, if you said, well, are you risk tolerant? Are you risk averse? Are you open to risk? And people, they're like, oh yeah, this is where I fit. And you say, okay, well, within that category, what you might lose a finger or, something like that. And they're like, no, actually, I'm not that. I don't want to lose a finger. I don't want to break my arm. I don't want to fall down and go boom, because it hurts. So have you ever been in a situation, Robin, where you were outside your risk tolerance? And if so, can you tell us about how it affected your performance and ultimately your experience?
Yep, I've been in Portillo Chile skiing, and I thought I would ski a pretty steep, narrow chute. And I was doing just that. And there I was, just skiing along, as the saying goes. And my ski came off, and I found myself in a really steep, narrow chute that required just a wee bit of air, but a bit of air nonetheless. And I had one ski on, and I was like paralyzed with fear, just over my head, wasn't sure what to do. And just had to get very matter of fact about it and look at what the situation was, where I was, what my options are. There's, at least here at Heavenly, and I think in Vail Resorts, one of our approaches to looking at terrain, we call it the 5 T's, where you look at what's the task you're doing, what's the terrain like, what's the timing of the day like, what's the traffic like, what are the tactics you're using, what's the snow surface like, and you kind of use those things to inform your decision making. And in that situation, I just had to look, okay, what is the snow like? If I go off this little air with one ski, am I likely to sink into the snow and that would be a cushy landing? Am I likely to accelerate and get into trouble? There's also a rock at the bottom of that. So you had to make a very quick left footer right turn. Just very deliberate, matter of fact, caught my breath, ended up kind of side slipping down most of the chute, and then just pointing it that last little bit and picking up my foot over some rocks. I made it. I sat on my hip for a bit. But yeah, just having a very specific plan. And in my case, it was just looking at these 5 T's and how are those going to interact with my skis? How are those going to interact with the speed that I'm going to have? If things do go wrong, will I continue to cartwheel? Or if I do fall, will I be okay? In that case, it was about 15 feet of really high risk, and then I was going to be okay. But if that had got to that little landing and then it was another massive drop, I would have had to have come up with a different plan.
Wow, that's crazy. So, Robin, when it comes to understanding and managing risk tolerance when we're delivering a venture, What are some common mistakes that guides, instructors, parents, and friends can end up making?
When we're looking at how to make decisions and plan best around situations where we're evaluating somebody else's tolerance for risk comes into play, I think probably the biggest mistake is just not checking in with somebody, not checking in ahead of time and saying, are you happy pushing yourself, or are you more conservative? And at the end of the day, the conservative and the aggressive person might end up in the same spot, but how they progress to getting there could be different. One person might just be okay jumping in with 2 feet, and one person might be more comfortable progressing into that little by little. I think not making plans. Axel Lund Svindal, who's a Norwegian ski racer, used to train in Portillo, Chile, and there's a lot of speed training, so downhill training, and there was this one curve that was very high risk. And he made a comment one time that he always looked at what his exit route would be. If he didn't make the jump and make the landing, where is his exit route going to be? And so again, when you're in situations and things could go wrong, like if you're going to do a jump on your bike or a fast corner, like if things go wrong, do you know what your exit plan is going to be? And I think that's part of a really important plan. Assuming that people all have the same tolerance. Again, maybe you're the person who's super risk tolerant and has a high appetite for it, and assuming that your buddy, your kid, or your client is the same is a really big mistake. The trust me, I'm your guide will only get you into trouble. And likewise, the other side of that is assuming that everybody wants to be conservative. That could lose clients and make your kid maybe not want to go ski with you or ride a bike with you or climb with you. Yeah, and then just again, assuming that people all like to have the same pace when they're going into risk. So I think just having plans, checking in with people, having a format that you like to follow. It's another thing that we use in the ski and ride school. It's called the safety of self prioritization. And if I'm I need to take care of my safety first. If I'm guiding Jordy and Chris out on a mountain someplace and I get injured, I'm clearly not going to be a very good guide for you because I'm injured. And so by my taking care of my own safety first, that is in service of you. And I think sometimes people that are out, especially dealing with paying clients, think that it's okay to take a risk for their own health in order to look out for their guests. And at the end of the day, again, if I'm injured, whether it's on a beginner run or on a mountain guiding, climbing, or something like that, if I'm not looking out after my safety first, then I'm not in service of my guests. I had that happen once, teaching a lesson, kind of frozen coral head snow amongst the trees, and I love that kind of snow, and I was probably skiing faster than I should have been in that snow with my guest. Fell, my hand hit a tree, I broke my thumb, lesson was over. So I didn't make the right decisions in that situation. I ended up getting hurt, and so the lesson was over. Guest didn't have the best day.
It's such a good point that you make, that risk tolerance, it's about the people. So let me take a step back here. If we're leading other people, we're constantly trying to make sure that we are giving them enough challenge to make sure they don't get bored or to make sure they don't go over their heads. But at the same time, if you're the leader, you need to make sure that you're operating in your own risk tolerance as well. Another thing that I notice that's happened over time is I have quite a few people that will return to ski with me year after year. And as they get older, their risk tolerance actually has been changing. And so I have had to adjust my expectation of what they actually want because it's changed from year to year. And if you have some people that can actually change during the course of a day as people either get tired, or they might find that what you're doing is harder than they expected, or they might find that it's actually easier than they expected because they've gotten better thanks to the help that you've been able to give them. So I find you really have to be on top of trying to evaluate all of those things. And there's another thing, and I don't know if you find this, Robin, but I find that people can have a really hard time understanding what it actually means. So when you're trying to assess what somebody's risk tolerance is, and you say, well, we're going to go and do this, they might say, that sounds great, but they might not even know what that means if they haven't done that before. How do you deal with those types of situations?
Yeah, that's such a great point, Chris. A lot of people, when you ask them how comfortable they are with risk, it doesn't really resonate because maybe in their day-to-day life, it's just not a concept that they deal with, right? And I think that's where our making sure we're creating trust definitely comes into play, and having a really good line of questions that you're asking people. Are you tired? How's your cognitive ability right now? How's your brain working? Do you feel like you're fresh and can think about things? Are you okay with working hard? That's a concept that I talk about a lot. Not everybody likes to work hard. There's a lot of us that think working hard is one of the most fun things we can do, and there's a lot of us that think working hard is like a 4-letter word, right? That's part of the question line that I would always ask someone: is that you okay working right now? This is going to be hard. I'm going to need you to pay attention. I'm going to need you to listen to what I'm talking about right now. Are you okay with these things?
So you were talking about trust there.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it is, sometimes there's actually predictions that come from the person who's less trustworthy, and it actually is, it fulfills the prophecy. And this can be the case with kids, right? And parents. And you're trying to, you're saying, trust me, I'm the more experienced person. Like guides and parents do that all the time. And you're not always right. And friends of mine, they had a young kid who was friends with my son back in the day, and he's probably, I don't know, 4 years old, and they'd bought a trailer bike, right, that attaches to the back of your adult bike, and then the kids get to ride along behind, and he did not like it. This kid, he told his parents, he's like, I don't trust this. I don't feel in control. What happens if this thing comes detached? I don't have a wheel in front of me then. And they're like, that's not going to happen. Like it's going to stay attached. And they're riding through downtown in a small town, Revelstoke, BC, and it becomes detached. And this kid he's like, he drops, and he's like, there's sparks flying on the pavement, and he goes on his side, and basically it's the handlebar and the pedal, and he just sort of tucks in his shoulder and his knee, and he just goes grating and grating along and stops. And he is unhurt because he has tucked himself into a little tiny ball away from the pavement. And he says, I told you so. And they're like, are you okay? And you were right. So we're not always, our risk tolerance and our knowledge. Sometimes it can bite you too, right? You're like, that the bad thing did happen. I can't believe that. Like, how is that even possible? But
yeah, I've had a similar situation, and it's completely and utterly devastating. And we're all human. We're all capable of making mistakes and always will make mistakes. But I had this young woman that I was teaching skiing to, and I had convinced her to take this little shortcut to another run. And we were crossing a road, and I said, don't worry, literally, like, don't worry. I'm going to stand and I'm going to like flag, the universal sign, cross my arms above my head. And I said, okay, you can go now. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, another guest came down and like completely like hit my ski pole out of the way and completely dissed the fact that I was blocking the traffic, and hit her and put a pretty big slice in her leg. So yes, very similar thing. I was just like, don't worry, trust me, I've got this. And then it didn't work. So that, I'm sure, cost her some of her risk tolerance in knowing that here's the person that's the quote unquote expert and someone to trust. And it didn't quite work out the way we hoped to. Yeah, I can tell you too that listening to the story about the little guy on the bike, when I'm performing for myself or playing for myself, my tolerance for risk is way higher than it is when I'm guiding others, because I don't want to be responsible for hurting other people, right? I think it's always important to recognize that if I'm guiding people on terrain where there is a no-fall zone, I really dislike it, and I will not do it unless somebody really, really, really wants me to. I don't like putting myself in the situation where someone could die or get seriously injured if they're with me. And that's part of our job. Sometimes we have to put ourselves there. I think I will always err. I mentioned just decision-making and having sound decision-making skills. I would always rather take the better decision maker on a riskier path than I would somebody maybe that's even a little bit higher skill, but not as good as decision making. Like I was skiing with my nephew a couple of years ago, who was a very novice skier, but a ridiculously good athlete. And I watched him fall a couple of times, and how he controlled his fall and the direction of his fall around like lift towers and rocks. It was clear he was a really good decision maker. And so I was able to take him into riskier situations than somebody that might have had more experience skiing and more skilled, but just wasn't as aware of their surroundings and didn't make the same kind of like instinctual decisions that my nephew was making at the time. Again, in the same vein as decision making, I think sometimes there's people that get into a situation, whether it's skiing or mountain biking or climbing or whatever, and they look at a route they're going to use. And I think if the only kind of actionable a person can have is, oh, I'll figure this out as I go, I think that's a huge red flag. Like we should all be able to stand at the top of or at the bottom of a route or a run and be able to come up with a game plan on how we might approach that and attack that. And some people say, no, I just always figure it out on the fly. I don't like thinking about it. And it's okay if you do that sometimes. But if you're standing again at the bottom of a route or at the top of a run and you can't assess what's going on, and here's what the conditions are like, here's what the environment is like, here's the plan I'm going to take, here's the tactics I'm going to take, your decision-making skills are definitely flawed, or your assessment skills, one or the other. And I think practicing those in really simple environments, again, if you're a ski instructor, you get to a beginner run and you look down it and you kind of go through your little checklist of what's going on, so that when you're in a situation where there is a no fall zone, you've been in that situation, you've practiced it, and you've gotten competent at it.
Well, I think you raise a really good point there. And I think often when we're leading other people, you're trying to balance those three things of skill, will, and resilience. And some people have the will to do it, so it's within their risk tolerance, but they don't have the skill. Some people might have both, but if something goes wrong, they don't have the resiliency to be able to deal with it. So using your example of that no fall zone, if you have somebody take a fall and they go over that no fall zone, how are they going to deal with the ramifications? So as Jordy, said earlier, well, if you do this, you can end up with a broken arm. Well, how do you know really what you're going to feel like and how you're going to deal with that if you end up with that broken arm? What if it's your right arm and you're right-handed and you work on a laptop all day and you're going to be out of action for 6 weeks? Can you deal with that? And so having people picture that in the moment of what this would actually look like to affect their decision making can be really tough, especially when, as Jordy pointed out earlier, people only see the win. They only see, oh, I get to go to this place and that looks really cool and I'm going to have an awesome story to tell about it. They don't necessarily have the ability to process what could happen. And as a leader, you need to be able to do that. You need to be able to sift through will, skill, resilience. And you know what? We can probably do this, but if this goes sideways, you're not actually going to like it. You're not going to be very happy if your arm's in a cast, or your leg's in a cast, or you end up with concussion, or this is just miserable. Most of the time things just suck, right? They don't, most of my people don't go away with broken pieces of their body. It just isn't enjoyable, which is one way that I try to talk people out of things, but to just say, listen, I don't think you want to do this because I don't think you're going to enjoy it. And when you tell people they're not going to enjoy it, then usually you're right. I don't want to do that. That doesn't sound like a lot of fun.
People definitely enjoy seeing my rescue team arrive, but they don't enjoy calling for help. And they don't enjoy the consequences and the realities of why they're calling for help. It's just somewhere where you don't want to go, right? It's not losing a few dollars. It's actually your broken leg or your head injury that you're dealing with.
There's a saying in Spanish, or at least in Chile, that is, if someone has tiene más confianza que conocimiento. So if somebody has more confidence than knowledge. And those are sort of the situations I think Chris was just describing earlier. And again, the flip side of that, sometimes people only see the win and they don't see the potential consequences. And then there's the people that the super risk averse people that only see that they're going to break their arm, and they don't see themselves as being successful and like upping their performance or upping their confidence or upping their, just the ability to like, hey, I can do things. And that's, I think, our job as guides and coaches and leaders is to know when and where we need to create an awareness of maybe one side of that equation or the other.
So how can we tell if someone is outside their risk tolerance?
Best case scenario, they tell us. But if we don't tell them, again, we'll just start to see how it manifests physiologically, and maybe we'll see them sweating a little bit. Maybe we'll just see body language that shows lack of confidence, moving away from the group. Maybe we'll just see their performance deteriorate. Maybe they could normally make really crisp, tight turns, or get their wheels up over a rock on a bike or something like that pretty easily, and all of a sudden they're not able to do that anymore, and their performance is sort of clunky. I think that's probably the biggest like outward sign that we can see, is just that their performance and their body language change, oftentimes pretty dramatically. And again, in a best case scenario, we're checking in on a regular basis, so we see that stuff coming. If we're with multiple people or we're managing a lot of different risks simultaneously, we don't always see that coming, and we have to deal with it once it's plopped right on our lap. But yeah, just being aware of how the performance may or may not be altered.
And it is a little bit different if somebody's, if it's say a repeat guest client, partner in adventure, and oh, they're not talking and they usually talk a lot, or they're talking a lot and they usually don't talk. But when they're newer to us, like happens to us a lot, right, with clients and guests in the various industries that we're in, we can not know anything about them. And you can think, oh, that person that I spent the day with, first time I met them, they were super nervous all day, but actually they weren't. You just don't really know what their normal behavior is. And that's just their normal behavior.
Yeah, that's so true. And I fall back to my numerical system in those instances, because I've watched somebody ski down and look like they were just on top of the world, singing, crushing it, low heart rate. And I would ask them, how comfortable were they on that? And I would use, again, my 1 to 10 scale, and they would be like almost pinned. And there was nothing, because I didn't know them well enough, there was nothing that I could observe that I could have guessed. And so I just have to ask. That's a really big thing for me, is making sure that I'm asking. And again, I always go back to that numerical scale, especially with people that I don't know. And then again, there's people that maybe they're pinned and they like that. So I would always follow up, do you want to be there? Do we want to lower that? Do we want to keep that pinned? Again, what motivates us and what makes us feel like we've accomplished something and that we, high five at the end of the day. It's so individual and it's so different. And somebody could say that they're if 1's easy and 10's hard, that they're a 2, and that's as hard as they want to go, and they feel accomplished with that. And then a lot of us would think, I'm a little bit bored with this. What else you got for me?
Yeah, and it's not always the experience that's the risk. It can sometimes be the environment, right? So if we're out in the cold and we know it's cold and we're used to it and we're dressed for it and we're out there every day and we're out with people and they're kind of indicating they're a bit cold, and then they're not cold, right? Their feet, they're not complaining about their feet. And that's a time where we need to be very vigilant and take charge, basically say, hey, we need to look at that. Let's you're saying your feet aren't cold anymore, and that concerns me. And they may not be complaining about it at all because they're actually frozen.
Or they think, I'm just going to suck this up. It's a little bit of cold. I'll be fine with it. Yeah, no, you have my number with that one, Jordy. I've had a couple of different situations. One was life-threatening, where I got too cold, decided to sit down and take a nap on a tree and let the snow pass. Which once I snapped to, I realized what danger I was actually in. I was about 2.5 hours from the trailhead where I was, but 100%. And just again, as us being the leaders and the guides and the instructors and the coaches, just recognizing those symptoms. Not only do we have to be able to check in with people, but recognize what are those physical symptoms. sometimes people get super giggly when they're uncomfortable, and that could be easily misconstrued as they're having the time of their life, but is what's normal for them. And you alluded to that earlier. Are they talking a lot and they normally don't, and or vice versa? The more you know people, the easier it is to identify those behaviors. But yeah, we definitely need to be knowledgeable about the physical symptoms and what things to look for, and educate our guests on what things to look for. Like, it's not a joke if your feet are cold. It's not a joke if there's a white patch on your cheek. And then just making sure we're super vigilant and not afraid to call somebody out on those things, or have somebody call us out on those things.
I think your strategy with using the numbers to check in is a really good one. I've found out the hard way that people don't always tell you the truth. And it's not necessarily that people are maybe lying. They might not know what the truth is. They might be embarrassed to tell you what it is they really want. They might be embarrassed to say what they really want in front of other people that they're with, especially if they're in a group, right? Where they're feeling that pressure to go and do that harder thing because everybody else wants to do that harder thing, but they don't want to do that harder thing. Or vice versa. I've actually had it where people are happy. They tell you they're happy to be with the person who wants to do the lower risk thing, even though that's actually not meeting their needs, right? They're really, okay, I'm just with, I'm with my children or my friends or my spouse. I really want to go do something harder, but I said I'd be here to support them. And of course, it's really hard to meet their needs if they're not being challenged. So I find you really have to be a detective and use some discretion and sometimes a soft touch to get the truth out of people.
Yeah, I can't agree with that anymore too. And I think in the group environment, absolutely, I think it's always important, if there is a group, to ask in the group environment, and then also individually, so that somebody, if they do need to answer that question in private, that they can. I think it's important to ask the same question a bunch of different times, a bunch of different ways. I'm sorry. Are you happy taking it easy? Would you like to push yourself? And then your example of getting him to be aware of what it's like at the end of the day if your arm is broken. Well, if it's the end of the day and you didn't accomplish this because you chose the more conservative route to support your partner, are you going to be okay with that? And just letting him know that there's ways, if there are in fact ways, that there are ways to accommodate both, and making sure that you put that out there so that there is an option for them.
Yeah, I really find it is important to give people options and to outline what those options are going to look like. And of course, if you don't want somebody to choose an option, then you make it sound like it's very undesirable and make the option that you want them to choose sound really appealing. But giving people that information so that they can actually make an informed decision is really key. To try to get them to pick what you want them to pick. Obviously, if you're in a leadership role, you can just go and make all the decisions, but you might find that people are disappointed, right? They felt like, well, I wanted to do something harder. Well, actually, I know you didn't want to do the thing that was harder that was available to us because I know what that looks like. But because we didn't have that discussion beforehand, now you're disappointed we didn't go and do that, right? And that can create a lot of friction and conflict and disappointment afterwards. So I find that trying to have that discussion early as to why we don't want to do that thing that you think you want to do is way more beneficial than having to go through it after the fact.
Yeah, 100%. And the whole, again, what our ultimate goals are to create trust and instill confidence, like that doesn't happen in one instant in time. Like that's an ongoing process, right? And if we're disappointing somebody because we're not doing something that they really, really want to do, and they're not okay with it, maybe it isn't the outcome that they wanted, but if they're not buying into your decision, if you had to make a decision that, look, this is just not a safe option for us right now, it's not an option, then there were probably steps that weren't taken up front that could have been taken to start to develop that understanding and that trust. Like, here's how I'm making this decision. It's based on this, this, and this. And We've had this conversation around what your abilities are, and we've had the conversation around what the conditions are like. If we did it 4 hours ago, it would have been okay. Right now, it isn't. Again, it's really hard when we're juggling so many different balls and manipulating so many different things and managing so many different risks. But the constant communication with people so that they're comfortable being as forthright as possible to us. When you said earlier that people aren't always being truthful, and maybe sometimes it's deliberate and sometimes it isn't. Maybe they don't even know they're not being truthful, but setting up the environment so that people can feel the most comfortable. And sometimes we just have to teach them how to recognize whether or not they're comfortable or not, or whether or not they're ready to take the next risk. Like, could you do everything you wanted to on that shoot over there? Like, did you turn exactly where you wanted to 90% of the time? Well, maybe you are ready for something harder then. If you got down it again, the example that I gave earlier, I'll just figure it out as I go. If that's the best you've got, that's a flawed technique, and we need to work on some things before we progress from that.
Yeah, that survival learning doesn't work for everybody, for sure. So a lot of what we're saying here, it's much easier to do with adults than kids, and there are some differences between managing risk tolerance and assessing it in kids versus adults. What kinds of things do we need to be aware of there?
Like, I am not going to be risk tolerant. I'm going to be very risk averse with somebody else's kids, period. And I'm okay with that. If you as a parent want to take some bigger risks with your kids, and again, all within reason, we'll take small risks, but risks where they have a higher likelihood of getting hurt or just being in a situation. I'm okay being risk averse with kids, especially with somebody else's kids, because I don't have them. And teenagers, 100%. The more you can involve them in decision making, and it can be simple decisions in the beginning, so you learn to trust each other. Like, which run should we go to? Okay, we're at the top of a run. Let's take a peek down here. Tell me what you're seeing in the snow. Okay, you're seeing the snow on this side of the run is shaded and a little bit icy, and over here it's good dry. So let's go ski the easier snow. Like, help teach them how to make decisions so that they know that you trust them enough to give them knowledge and help them make decisions. And then little by little, you can progress in the level of decision making that they're taking or that they're making, so that you can collectively make a decision towards a higher risk activity if that's where you're going.
So do you have any other insights for our listeners when it comes to recognizing and managing people's risk tolerance when we're teaching or guiding others?
Yeah, I think just like any other skill set, being able to assess a situation, being able to make good decisions in a situation, like any other skill set, takes practice, and just not to discount the value of practicing things like that in environments where you're comfortable, so that you get comfortable having a format or a checklist that you use, however you like to do it, whether it's the 5 T's that I shared earlier, or the OODA loop, which is a military way of making decisions. There's just so many different formats, but have yours and practice it, so that when you get into a situation where it's a critical decision, you're versed in that process.
Well, this has been awesome. Thanks so much, Robin, for joining us today. And we hope you have a great summer.
That's my plan. Thank you so much for your time and for asking some great questions. It gives me some good fodder for my bike ride home. And I wish you both a great summer as well.
If you would like to find out more about Robin, we have added a few links to articles about her in the show notes. You can also find her at the Heavenly Snow School in California. Or is that Nevada?
Well, Chris, technically, I think the ski area is actually in both states.
Yes, I think you're right, Jordy. So what stood out to you from this discussion?
Well, Chris, let's start with defining what risk tolerance is. Risk tolerance is what you're comfortable losing or giving up. Essentially, it is our appetite for taking risk. Because it is quite personal to each of us, it can be quite subjective and perception-based. Each of us views risk differently, and this perception can change throughout an activity or during the day. For this reason, it's important to be able to identify what a person's risk tolerance is up front, and to keep evaluating it as we go along. Some of the strategies Robin uses to determine risk tolerance is to use a number scale to gauge people's level of tolerance. Part of doing this successfully is to learn what a person's rating means to them. Another strategy is to keep asking them how they're feeling and how much risk they are interested in continuing to take on. As people progress throughout the day, they might become more confident and wish to take on more risk. Alternatively, they might start to get tired and decide to start scaling it back. This is where finishing with flow can be a great strategy when we're designing an adventure experience.
Great points, Jordy. It's definitely worth noting that the more risk tolerant a person is, the bigger the margin of error a leader has to play with. When people are willing to take on more risk, a coach, instructor, guide, leader, or parent usually has a bit more leeway in taking on bigger chances. People tend to be more resilient in dealing with things if they go wrong when they are more comfortable with taking risks. The key is to make sure that people have enough skill to go along with their will. Robin touched on the situation that many of us have faced where someone has more confidence than knowledge. When this happens, they may only see the win, not the risk. One situation where this can happen is with kids who may not have the ability to judge the consequences of following a specific path or the ability to calculate the potential for suffering those consequences. This is the classic example where the people we may be leading don't know what they don't know. This is where experience comes into play, helping a leader to make the right decision. Another area where experience plays an important role is spotting people when they're outside their risk tolerance. We can see this when performance deteriorates, body position becomes defensive, and people may become quieter or more talkative than normal. As Robin mentioned, we have to keep checking in with people, asking them how they're doing, communicating the risks, giving people options, and watching their reactions carefully. Jordy, the one caveat to all of this is that people aren't always truthful or forthcoming. People may misrepresent their goals and expectations. They may not know what they want. They may also be too embarrassed to tell you what they really want.
That's a great point, Chris. As Robin mentioned, assessing and managing people's risk tolerance isn't always easy, but it is essential to ensure they aren't overly challenged or bored. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks again to Robin Barnes. If you haven't already done so, please consider sharing this episode with your social network. The more people we can get listening to the show, the more content we can bring you. Thanks for listening.